Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I have to thank Fakiri, Knowledge at Wharton, Momentum, and Council of the Americas for allowing Transactional Track Record to be a part of this exciting conversation. And it's really a privilege to be part of a conversation that discusses a sector of the Cuban economy that can really offer something to the world. You know, a lot of these panels have been focusing on where Cuba might be behind, and I think this panel shows us that Cuba also has something to offer the rest of the world, and our panelists can comment on this further. We have Professor Stephen Ullmann from University of Miami, and Philippe Pouletty from Abivax, chairman of Abivax. And I'll let them introduce themselves briefly. For my part, I'm a Cuba-phile from a long time, and I've been working with Transactional Track Record as editor since November, launching proprietary intelligence. So we aggregate intelligence from other media. We have a transactional database, and we focus mostly on mergers and acquisitions, pre-IPO opportunities, as well as joint venture opportunities. And perhaps in the joint ventures, that's where it might be most applicable in the case of Cuba, at least at this juncture. Obviously, there's some variations on that with licensing agreements, which we'll hear about a little bit further. Could we start with you, Stephen? Could you introduce yourself briefly and give us some context where Cuba is?
Tengo mi café cubano, más o menos, para la tarde. My name is Steve Ullmann. I'm a professor of healthcare economics and healthcare management, medical ethics at the University of Miami. I'm also the director of our Center for Health Sector Management and Policy. And probably the main reason I'm here is that my co-author in England and I just published a book that came out literally 3 months ago after about 2.5 years of research on healthcare in Cuba, called Cuban Healthcare, Utopian Dreams, Fragile Future. So we did a lot of work on that, including the biotech and pharma industry.
I'm Philippe Pouletty. I have a slight French accent. I'm MD and a serial entrepreneur in biotech. I spent 12 years in Silicon Valley, and I'm former Stanford. And in the last 5 years, we have set up a strong collaboration with the Cuban Institute of Biotechnology and with my fund Truffle Capital, where we manage 700 million euros, while betting a fraction of that on the relationship of Western biotech companies and Cuba.
Thank you both for being here. So let's start with Stephen. Just give us a little historical context on how Cuba entered this space and became somewhat of a pioneer, and how this industry is important for Cuba.
I think there have been a couple of panels already that have talked about the strength of the biotech and pharma industry and one of the areas where there is potential investment. But the history goes back to around 1970 when Fidel Castro indicated that that was one of the areas he was looking at, called the Medicuba, was the original organization he structured with the concept of basically limiting imports of pharmaceuticals, wanting to make sure that essentially 80% of pharmaceutical needs were going to be met internally, and then also to create an export sector as well for hard currency. And so that was the initial structure. In 1980, he was influenced by a meeting he had with the new president of MD Anderson in Houston, who had just come back from Helsinki and looked at, had been exploring the concept of interferon and for cancer treatment. And Fidel indicated that maybe this was an area of focus, given that Cuba had already a strong educational program with lots of scientists and lots of technicians. And so he sent a team to MD Anderson and then to Helsinki to start the startup of biomed pharmaceutical, and sort of expanded from there. There are 10 now centers for biotech and pharmaceuticals. One of them is CIBG, which Philippe has interactions with directly. There are another 50 research institutes on top of that, and all of those have marketing arms as well that they've established with the realization that, again, this is a very strong export for Cuba. And I know Philippe can talk about some of the specifics of those exports. And there's also a very strong structure as well of joint ventures with Canada, with China, with India, with Brazil, Mexico, and also licensure agreements throughout Europe, for example. So there's a very strong structure. There are 25,000 scientists who work in this field and 37,000 plus researchers who work in this field as well as support staff. So it's a very strong industry. And then the most interesting thing that's just happened is, or recently happened, is the structure of what's called Bio-Cuba Pharma, which is essentially a consortium now of 30 plus centers and research institutes in Cuba, as well as marketing arms that have now basically gone semi-independent, or not semi, totally independent, gaining no oversight by the Cuban government and getting no subsidy from the Cuban government, utilizing modern strategic planning methodologies, quality improvement, process improvement, to structure essentially a profit-growing industry to, again, focus on exports out of Cuba, and now trying to meet 90% of domestic pharmaceutical needs in the country.
So if you would compare, to some extent it seems that's somewhat of a import substitution strategy in terms of not importing drugs for the local population. Give me some sense for, or give the audience some sense for the development so far of the industry in terms of, providing drugs that could otherwise be imported versus Cuba as an innovation center, on the cutting edge of the field.
Well, cutting edge is part of the structure of the industry. There have been a lot of discoveries that have been coming out of this sector, vaccines, structured vaccines that meet the needs of, if you will, developing countries, but domestically as well, there's a very strong structure to meet those needs. The pharmacy sector in Cuba, the retail pharmacy, is very much an integrated part of the whole medical delivery system. Pharmacists have a much larger role in Cuba than they do in the United States as being part of the medical team. So there's almost a direct link between the pharmaceutical sector and the development of pharmaceuticals and then movement through the retail structure and into the community for population health that comes out of that. Cuba is unique, even in the eyes of the World Health Organization and PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, in that World Health Organization tries to emphasize and encourage developing countries to indeed import their pharmaceuticals. The suggestion is that it really doesn't make a lot of economic sense. But the World Health Organization and PAHO see Cuba as different and actually sees it as advantageous to Cuba to basically have developed its own internal pharmaceutical sector to meet its own needs.
I was down in Havana in January, and I met with representatives of the Center for Molecular Immunology, which is an organization that's had joint ventures going back to I guess 1994. Why was it that this field was ideal for Cuba to seek joint ventures and these kind of relationships abroad?
Healthcare or pharmaceutical sector is actually relatively inexpensive to provide in a global environment, in part because you have these highly trained scientists, highly trained researchers, but they don't get paid a lot, and that's part of it. They, as you heard, have been hearing, even in the professional sector, pay is generally $20 to $50, $60 a month, and so you have all this talent, highly trained talent, strongly involved and interested in research, wanting to produce because that's what gives researchers benefit. but it keeps the cost very low in terms of production, and that indeed makes it very attractive for joint ventures with other countries. And then other countries can also help in terms of cross-fertilization of knowledge and knowledge base, which Philippe, of course, has been directly involved with.
Right. So, Philippe, tell us, what was your motivation for considering Cuba as a ground for seeking joint venture opportunities? What made you first set your sights on Cuba?
Well, first, I like innovation in science, but I must say I like innovation in business as well. So structuring one of the first Western world biotech company which has a broad collaboration with Cuban Institute was a challenge. But the first reason was when I got there, we needed a vaccine antigen to do a clinical trial in Europe, and only Cuba could provide it. But we started to interact with the scientists, investigate the programs, audit the programs, developed a very friendly relationship. And I'm used to interact with Stanford, Scripps, CNRS, INSERM, Pasteur Institute, so I have a good comparison of level of science and dedication to work and so on. And what I found was not at all what you could find in China or India many years ago, something much stronger than in Brazil. But as you said, it's a very well-trained scientist. If you mix up in the same room people from Pasteur Institute, CIGB, and Stanford, I'm not sure you'll guess who is whom from their scientific presentation. Right. People who understand very well IP, intellectual property, publish, are paid very little, but are very dedicated and proud of what they are doing because it's also about healthcare and saving lives. So we decided to say, well, this is a very big opportunity for a biotech company like us and investors like us to structure a balanced relationship where we could have access to late-stage product candidates, very innovative products, at reasonable access upfront cost, with a high-quality R&D of low cost, and also something which is unique. They have structured their research center linked to manufacturing capabilities. Right. You know, usually in Europe, in the US, you have universities, and then company do tech transfer and will set up manufacturing. Well, they have, in a small environment, the research, the development, the manufacturing, and also the patients or the population to test, once tested in animals, of course, their vaccines. So they have great results on eradication of multiple infectious disease, for instance. So that was the reason behind. It took us several years to sign the first agreement. But since I was trained to deal with the French government, it was not that hard to deal with the Cuban government, I tell you. And now, on both sides, we are very happy. And I'd like to make a comment as compared to what I heard all day about helping Cuba, supporting Cuba. When we interact with CIGB or Finlay Institute or CIM, they don't want us to help them or support them. They want us to have a balanced relation of equal between CIGB, Finlay, and Abivax, and that's what we're trying to do.
So what did you encounter was their motivation? We heard from other presenters today, for example, in the tourism industry, you know, when they do a joint venture with a Spanish hotel group, it's probably because they don't have the capital to invest, to renovate, and they don't have the capacity to bring the guests. What was the motivation that you found? Why were they interested in having this dialogue? I know it took 2 years, but
they have local strong R&D and manufacturing capabilities. They have a hard time to organize international clinical trial, to manage this trial, to send people abroad. They are used to deal from government to government, so Cuba to Chinese government, Cuba to Vietnamese government. They don't have the habits of marketing and sales to the private sector. And certainly, you know that a drug, a vaccine, is very expensive to develop. They certainly need also help, expertise, and cash to address a worldwide opportunity. And that's what we have structured, where our teams work very closely together, meet frequently together to try to expeditiously develop internationally the best products to try to get them approved in multiple countries.
And clinical trials done in countries such as France and other countries throughout Europe give legitimacy to some of the discoveries that are also coming out of Cuba, because otherwise it was all internal. There would be questioning associated with that. So that comes out of it as well. One of the joint ventures actually was with a U.S. company back in 2003, so there even is a little bit of history. U.S. Treasury provided a license to a company working on a cancer treatment, and it didn't work out efficaciously, but it was one of those first inroads that a U.S. company had with the Cuban company in terms of this.
And did you find them more interested in generic drugs or pharmaceuticals for everyday needs, or in innovation?
Well, they manufacture altogether 900 different drugs. On the world market, you have 3,000. So certainly they have lots of generics, but it's not the same institute or management team which deal with generics versus very innovative products. So for instance, CIGB, the Institute of Molecular Biology, are probably on the forefront of level of science for innovative products. So the first one we're developing with them is a therapeutic vaccine to treat chronic hepatitis B. I think all of you have heard about Gilead coming with a novel drug for chronic hepatitis C, a blockbuster. Well, chronic hepatitis B is of the same magnitude in terms of number of patients, medical needs, potential market. And this product, which we developed together, has phase 2b results. It's the most advanced worldwide therapeutic vaccine. And excluding the US, given the embargo, it's still a $5 billion market opportunity. So I think the two big assets, which will be more important than tourism and anything else for Cuba, if well managed with the right partnership, is biotech and healthcare. You know, how can they use their very strong medical workforce as well?
And the irony is that Hep B is an example of a discovery that helps internally, because one of the problems in terms of the breakdown in infrastructure in Cuba is a very high rate of Hep B and Hep C because of non-sterilization going on with syringes, et cetera, and not enough supply of it. So here's an example of something that has very strong use as an export, but also very strong need.
Well, although, Steve, the prophylaxis of hepatitis B is taken care of by a vaccine, prophylactic vaccine, right, which is used more or less depending on countries. In fact, there is no more hepatitis B in Cuba, because the nice thing about a dictatorship, if when you say vaccination is mandatory, it has a meaning. So chronic hepatitis B is widespread in Asia, also in Europe, also in the US, but not anymore in Cuba, where they did the good job of preventing the disease, which can become chronic when not adequately prevented.
Give us some sense for the process. You said you were trained to deal with the French bureaucrats, and that helped in Cuba. But give us some kind of. We have a lot of people interested in doing business in Cuba. Give us some sense.
I'll give you some straight anecdotes. So once we'd looked at various projects, audited the quality, and said, we'd like to do partnership with you, I met with Fidelito Castro, who is the elderly son of Fidel. So when you ask, is Fidelito Castro influential, the answer is everyone is equally influential, but some people a little more than others. So I told him, I'm a capitalist, I'm a serial entrepreneur, I'd like to make you a capitalist proposal. What would you think, Mr. Castro, if we formed together a company called Euro-Cuba, where Cuba would become a minority shareholder of the biotech company, because if you build shareholder value, it's quicker than waiting for royalties of drugs which take years to develop. And he said, after thinking a minute, he said, you know, it's very interesting, but if you want us to do that, we can talk about it, but I'm afraid it will take many years. We're not yet ready for this. So I suggest, he said, you discuss exclusive licensing agreements on specific products because we know how to negotiate and sign this, and we'll see later on. I met with him again 3 weeks ago. I said, you remember what we talked about 4 years ago? What about Cuba becoming shareholder of a private company which would go public on the stock market in Europe or in the US? And this time he said, you know, we should talk more about that. We need to learn how it works. And since then, we have formed an advisory board which is co-chaired by the Dean of Havana University and myself. The members are the CEO of Pasteur Institute, the head of healthcare at Royal Bank of Canada, and a couple of Cuban scientists. And we've said, you know, we are going to make suggestions, giving you some advice, even if you're not asking for it, give you some example of what a spin-off could be, what a joint venture could be structured, which could function for the interest of US or European investors and for Cuba, because there is a lot of just unknown. We don't always talk the same language. You know, when someone says joint venture, what does this mean? Very different meaning for Cuba or for us. So, you know, we're going to continue to increase our relationship, but it took us 3 years to sign an agreement, but we started to work together a year and a half before signature of any agreement. And I think they liked that because we showed we were committed, we trusted them, even though each month they say the approval is coming next month, and they said that for a year and a half, but it finally came.
Professor Ullmann, what are the implications for this sector as Cuba becomes more open and friendly to U.S. investment?
Well, I think it does provide an opportunity. There's a great interest in terms of seeking out and interacting in terms of science. Again, the example in 2003 was the first bit of an inroad on that, and I think that there are pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies that are sort of very curious about getting involved and interacting. The one thing that would be sort of interesting is what happens to labor costs associated with the pharmaceutical sector as boundaries come down, barriers come down, and being an economist, you start looking at equilibrium starting to occur in terms of the amount that is paid for science, and so that could give a bit of take away some of that advantage, that cost advantage that pharmaceutical companies in Cuba currently have. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Fakiri mentioned a Canadian company, YM Biosciences, that was ultimately acquired by Gilead. It had a joint venture with the Center for Molecular Immunology, which was dissolved after that sale, and now SIEM has a joint venture with a company in Singapore. Do you see opportunities for the Pfizers, the Mercks of this world in Cuba, and have you monetized at all your investments there?
Well, certainly large pharma companies, especially the vaccine company, Sanofi, GSK, Novartis, all went to Cuba in the last 15 years. But what our Cuban friends told us is the approach of these companies was to say, well, we're interested in some of your products, but you should understand Cuba's reputation, the embargo, our US business means we have to buy out what you are doing, and we'll do the manufacturing in the US, in Europe, or in Puerto Rico. And that didn't work, because I think that the Cubans have a plan, not very detailed, but a plan to say the biotech is a big asset, and they want to be there in the long term. So, for instance, when we discussed our interaction, we said, we have audited your manufacturing capabilities, quality, and scale. It's very good. And as long as you can manufacture to meet the demand and the regulations, we have no reason to ask to manufacture ourselves. And that certainly they like, because they see that as a balanced relationship. with respect to would we sell or sub-license assets to a Pfizer and so on, certainly as a European Abivax independent biotech company, we want to have full control of whether we'll develop and market directly, whether we sub-license, whether we sell the company, and they understand that. But since we're developing several products together, they think it's a good partnership. And in fact, they are proposing us to look at multiple other projects, either within Abivax or forming parallel companies, which could be European or incorporated, or maybe soon incorporated in Cuba.
So really the embargo has had an impact on the large multinational pharmas getting involved.
No, because the large pharma came in the last 15 years, not in the last 6 months, right? The embargo limited probably the way they could do business. We don't see them rushing right now to do business with Cuba. And what the CIGB management, the government is telling us, first they are telling us, thank you for having been there years before Obama and Raul talked, which is to tell us, that has value because you took a risk and you are loyal to us, and we'd like to continue and increase our relationship, which is not to say that we will not face competition, and I think it's very healthy to encourage competition, but I think we have an advantage. We were there before. We have resources to expand. François Hollande is going to Cuba. François Hollande is the French president. Maybe not for long. The French president is going to Cuba as a state visit. So I think it's important for the U.S. investors to understand that if they wait for the lift of the embargo, which, as we heard, could take years, well, a lot of things will have happened before that, especially from Europe.
Is this the preferred way for them to finance their research in partnership with Abivax?
Well, I've proposed that to them. I've told them if you were listing on Nasdaq BioCuba Pharma today, you would probably be able to support the valuation of X billion pre-money. So you could say that's a way to go, but that's
soon to come.
Still a little complicated. They cannot, on their own, finance all of the development to market of all of the drugs, but like any company cannot finance independently of all their products. So the best way is partnerships with European, US, Asian companies who bring complementary skills from a clinical development, market access, reimbursement, marketing and sales level. But I'm betting you that the first Cuban Nasdaq IPO will probably come from the healthcare or biotech sector.
Yeah. I'm sure there's people here who are very happy to hear that. With that, I think we have to wrap up. So if you have any questions for these gentlemen, I think you'll have to find them after. We have to move on to our next panel. And want to thank them both once again for their time.